The BrainMender podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. It is strongly recommended that all users of this podcast should not disregard or delay in obtaining professional medical consultation for any medical condition they may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals before making any decisions about their medical care or treatment. Thank you for listening to BrainMender. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Dr. Peter Bongiorno. Dr. Bongiorno's passion is to bring effective holistic healing to the practice of mental health. He has thriving practices in New York City and Long Island, established in 2004. Prior to earning his naturopathic doctorate from Bastyr University, he researched as a pre-doctoral fellow at the National Institutes of Mental Health and did research at Yale University's Department of Pharmacology. Peter authored the first textbook on integrative medicine for depression in 2008, Healing Depression by CCNM Press. Since then, he's also authored numerous papers, textbook chapters, and books on the topic of integrative medicine for mental health, and teaches the naturopathic and functional medicine communities about how to effectively heal mood using natural remedies. His books for the public are Put Anxiety Behind You, and for depression care, he wrote, How Come They're Happy and I'm Not? His newest text for practitioners is Holistic Solutions for Anxiety and Depression, published by Norton. He joined SohoMD in 2022, where he's helping to build Soho's holistic care model. And you can find more information about Dr. Peter at drpeterbongiorno.com. And we'll put all those links into our description for the podcast today. And welcome, Dr. Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sean. I love that enthusiastic introduction.
Hey, I do my best. And it's really great to have you. And tap into your expertise in natural medicines and integrative healthcare. And specifically, what I was interested in talking about today was, where does cannabis fit into this pharmacopoeia of natural medicines? And now that we're seeing increased use of cannabis, how do we introduce patients to this and do it safely and legally, and talk about all these important things, including the side effects of these medications?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the interesting thing is in 2023, we're finally asking that question, how do we introduce this really for the first time into medicine as a whole? And the interesting thing is, it's probably one of the oldest of the medicines, going back millennia to Chinese medicine. So I think that's just fascinating alone to see how what's old is basically new again. And
Absolutely.
So that's the first thing I was thinking when you asked that question was, we're introducing it for the first time because we've virtually ignored it, or because of political reasons ignored it. Whatever the reasons, this has been around for a long, long, long time, and it's and plant medicines is so interesting because plants have these ingredients which are so compatible with our bodies and can help bring balance to our bodies. So we're finally getting to this particular one and trying to understand how it can help.
I think that's a great way to look at it. We've talked about in prior episodes that a lot of the medicines that come in little white pills and fancy capsules are derived directly from plants. And some of those compounds are unchanged. Some of them are modified. Some of them have led to discoveries. And, really not just plants, just the entire natural world has produced a bevy of natural medicines for us. And among them, cannabis, like you said, that's really been in use for millennia. But with prohibition about 100 years ago, it got removed from the pharmacopoeia and it got pretty seriously sidelined. But now that we're seeing this resurgence of legal medicinal cannabis, it's so important that patients look to people with knowledge and experience in the proper use of these really powerful medicines. And, if you use the wrong medicine for the wrong indication, it's not going to help you, right? So it's really critical that people talk to their physicians and to their healthcare providers about their health before they make any decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing to think about is, now that we're in this modern medical world and we're kind of and we're inserting this age-old remedy of 5,000-6,000 years. I think the thing to think about, and I would say this is true for natural medicines in general, is that if we look at them like another pill for an ill, meaning here, take it and your symptoms will go away, I don't think that's what natural medicines are about. When you think about natural medicines, there are these plant compounds that basically evolved to protect the plant and to help the plant, right? And in the case of cannabinoids, what do? They protect the, those flower buds from heat. They protect it from frost, maybe protect it from sunlight. Think about yourself, right? If you sat in the sun every day, all day, what would happen to you? You'd wither and die. Well, these plant compounds are there to protect the plant, and then when we take them in, they help us with things. They protect us in a way, and they balance us. And I think it's important to think about using plant medicines in that context because, when something like this comes up, and it's relatively new to most patients, they'll ask me, they'll say, oh, can I take this for this condition or for that condition? I'll say, yes, but, or maybe, but, because the but is, it needs to be done in context. We need to understand like what the cause of the illness is, and then how this particular plant medicine could fit in to help support the body to heal itself.
I mean, that's a really fascinating way to look at the way that our bodies integrate anything we eat into our
Yeah.
bodies. Is what was it there for before? What was its purpose? What type of a compound is this? And so when people are talking about eating organic foods and healthful foods that are locally grown, and especially focusing on a mostly plant-based diet, why are people talking about that? It's that there's all these useful compounds there that we can integrate into ourselves that will help us in some way. But like you said, too much of a good thing can be bad. And some of these compounds we need in trace amounts, and really you don't want to overdo it. I had a patient who told me about their son and his love for orange vegetables. He loved carrots and he loved sweet potatoes. And so they just kept on piling them on, piling them on. And before long,
Turned orange.
the kid turned orange.
Yeah, that happens.
And
I've seen that in one or two.
yeah, and there was a panic, and it was, let's check his liver, let's check this and that. And
Yeah.
Honestly, it can be, beta carotene can actually lead to significant problems, but at least at the beginning stages, it was really just, hey, let's not eat so much carrots and sweet potatoes. But I think it's an important lesson that we're going to talk about cannabis in the context of all these other natural medicines, but it's important for people to realize this is one of the heavy hitters among plants, right? Like if you were forming an all-star team of plant medicines, cannabis, I don't know which sport analogy to use, but cannabis would be on that all-star team in terms of what it's able to do, not just physically, but also mentally. It's a hammer, right? I guess opium would be a hammer as well, but we're not here mostly to talk about opium. But I do want to mention it because one of the things that Peter was talking about is that plants interact with our bodies, and it's given us insight into how our bodies work and how we're built. And we talk about opium and the compound that was easily derived from opium, morphine, and that it interacts directly with receptors in our body. And the same is true of cannabis. And there are receptors that cannabis interacts with directly in our body. So it's important not just that natural medicines have led to pharmacological medicines, but that also natural medicines and traditions have led to insights about how our bodies are built and how they work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to me. And, and when you think about what, what do cannabinoids do in our body, we also want to think about, what's the reason we're interested, So the reason we're interested is because people don't feel well, right? So how do these natural cannabinoids work to help that? So I like to think about this idea that, well, we're helping to bring back endocannabinoid tone. We're helping to bring back a system that maybe is suppressed, right? So the question is, well, what is suppressing it? So we know that stress, chronic stress will suppress it. We know that maybe smoking too much and nicotine will suppress it. We know that taking in too much food will suppress it. High levels of insulin, high levels of blood sugar, excess calories. We know alcohol can suppress it. We know drugs can suppress it. Maybe drugs that we're even taking to help the problems we're trying to fix, right, will actually move us more into dysfunction. And even excess THC, right, from marijuana can also suppress endocannabinoid tone. So it's amazing that that nature has provided us these things to help bring back balance. But as we think about using them, I also like to think about, well, what got us out of balance to begin with? So as we're using these things to help bring us back in balance, let's also make sure we're focusing on also the things that caused it. It's sort of like a bucket, right? You can keep filling the bucket up with water, but if you don't repair the leak, it's still going to keep lowering water. So, yeah.
I think that's a great way to look at it. And when you were talking about too much THC can lead to endocannabinoid disbalance, it really made me think of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, right?
Right.
Where we know that there's
Yeah.
the emergence now of this disorder that people are seeing in emergency rooms, and it's mostly in people with chronic cannabis use, but it can also be
Yeah.
just recent new onset high potency cannabis use, where, like Peter was talking about, the THC in these compounds, whether people are smoking it or they're eating too much of it in
Yeah.
edibles, um, leads to a disorder where people are vomiting horribly. They can't eat, and oddly, warm showers seems to help them. There's even
Hmm.
been a few cases of people burning their skin taking the hot showers that soothes them when they
Yeah.
have endocannabinoid hyperemesis system. Um, but it's true that uh, it's so important for people to look at it as, what am I going to try to do with this, and who can help me to best do this? Meaning,
Hmm.
self-medicating can lead to that hyperuse disorder where people get into trouble
Yeah.
and even make a new imbalance worse than the first one that they were trying to fix. And I think it's really interesting, some of the things that you brought up. Um, where do you think cannabis can overlap with some other of the natural medicines that people are normally using before cannabis became in vogue again and
Hmm.
CBD preparations became in vogue, and people are saying, "Oh, let me get on a hemp preparation because I heard that's good for me." Um, where does that overlap, and where what other natural medicines either might take the place of hemp and cannabis or might mesh really well with hemp and cannabis?
Yeah. Well, I think it's another tool in the natural medicine toolbox to look at and address some underlying issues. So certainly when the nervous system is on sympathetic mode, right, and it's hard for the body to calm down, I think it's a wonderful use. Also, I think there's a lot of good evidence that suggests when the body has a lot of inflammation, it can be very balancing for that. Also, specifically for sleep issues, there's specific mechanisms there that I think are very helpful. Certainly for pain. So I think it's one of those plant compounds that can really address underlying physiology, as opposed to just looking at symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the really interesting stories uh, that came out, it was probably like 10 or 15 years ago, was turmeric with curcumin
Mm-hmm.
and its anti-inflammatory properties. And what I found really interesting is some of the compounds that you see in some plants overlap with
Yeah.
other plants. So how do you make the determination of which plants are right for this person and which preparation is right for a different person?
Yeah. Well, that's why I think, a little knowledge and information comes along. I mean, I feel really lucky because the medical school I went to also taught a lot about natural medicines, and then the naturopathic doctors, a number of them that taught me were, had been around for a number of decades and just had experience with these plants. So, it's such a good point. These compounds, like let's say linalool, for example, right, is a compound that's found in cannabis, right? It's also found in lavender, right? So a lot of these eclectic botanical medicine practitioners from decades ago, they knew what they were for just from history of use. And so I think that's the first place to start. I would say if I had to pick one amazing resource, which I so respect highly because I think so much of botanical medicine came from it, was the First Nation culture, and where so many plants, our first understanding of them, at least the more Western botanicals, came from there, and then I would say the Eastern came from Chinese medicine. So those are great places to start, and just looking at the historical use. I mean, think about like foxglove, right? Was used by the Native Americans because they knew that when they used foxglove, if someone had problems with circulation and a lot of fatigue, they would take it, they would feel better, right? So foxglove is digitalis, right? So, and here's an interesting thing I think about plant medicine, which I really I think so important, is that when if you take foxglove as a plant, right? If you start to take too much of it, it'll start to make you nauseous and start to vomit because your body doesn't want any more of it. The medication digitalis, if you take a little bit too much of it, what happens? It
Bad
can,
things.
yeah, bad things. It can kill you. If you take too little, it doesn't do anything. If you take too much, there's this very narrow therapeutic window because we took the plant, we took out the component that affects the heart, and left everything else. So now we only take that. Whereas the plants themselves have all this other information it gives our body and says, "Hey, this is starting to be too much. Don't take any more of this." So there's such a beauty in botanical medicine that's built in, for safety, that's and even for efficacy, I think, because like you said, there so many of these compounds are in like a plant like cannabis or even hemp, and they work together. They work very synergistically. And I remember in botanical medicine classes, they would teach us if you could use a few compounds together, you'll gain more of the benefits and less of the side effects.
And that is really fascinating. I love the analogy that you used about that when we take out an essential part of this plant and start concentrating it, it becomes something that, it's not to say that, too much foxglove can obviously be dangerous, but that in its concentrated form, the word you used was information, that your body doesn't have this information that the plant can pass on to it. And that really spoke to me because, really it's very similar in some ways to what's happening in the opioid epidemic in our country.
Right.
It's not to say that opium wasn't a problem before, and it's certainly historically, opium alone has been an amazing problem. That has really changed history in some ways, and led to wars, and has plagued many nations. But certainly what we're seeing now is these highly potent and highly available preparations where in these little pills, you can have these massive concentrations that are far more dangerous than previously with just opium. Not to say that opium wasn't dangerous at all, but what's interesting is the interface between a plant and our body, and that information is being passed. And who's to say how these things evolved? For example, there's a lot of evidence that cannabis evolved in cultivation with humanity, that over maybe 10,000 years of evidence now that it was being cultivated and used as a medicinal. And now we're cultivating it maybe for a lot of the wrong reasons, because with recreational use starting up, we're losing a lot of the medicinal information because we're cultivating strains that have this really high THC content. We're losing the CBD content, and we're people are using it for, for fun. Obviously, we understand that it can get people high, but in terms of medicinal use, it's really important to look at the things like you were talking about. Well, what other information is there? And so we can look at the strain itself and say, well, if it's a really high potency THC strain, it's probably not medicinal. Or if it is medicinal, it probably has specific use cases, so that if someone was in really severe pain, for example, a high potency THC preparation might be helpful. But you also want to know, like you were saying, well, what's the source of that pain? How did they get there? Is this an acute traumatic event, or is this an inflammatory disorder? And then likewise, we're not going to give these high potency THC strains to people that are looking for anti-inflammatory properties. And in fact, we know that there's preparations of cannabis that have next to no THC. If you look at hemp preparations, there's less than 0.3%. And like we've talked about before, hemp is just another strain of cannabis. It's just a mutant strain that's really bad at making the psychoactive component THC. So it's really important, like you said, to look at, well, why are we here? What are we trying to do with it? And to look at, well, any good dispensary worth its labeling can get you an analysis, a certificate of analysis, and tell you all of these other compounds, not just the THC and the CBD, but it can tell you all these other terpenes. Those are the ones they really focus on. Of course, there's many other classes of compounds in cannabis that may be medicinal, but they really go through and they can tell you how much linalool is in this compound, how much limonene, how much myrcene, how much beta caryophyllene is in it, how much alpha caryophyllene. And these are all terpenes that are found in other plants. And I've always found it interesting that, like you were saying, some plants pair well together. So we can start to imagine, if something with lavender works well for something, then perhaps a high linalool strain of cannabis might also help someone with that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about overuse syndrome is, when it was legalized in New York and all the stores started popping up. I went into one. The first one I went into was in Brooklyn, and because I wanted to check out what's going on in there, and what are they selling. And I remember seeing on the shelf, and not even high on the shelf, but pretty low on the shelf, these brightly colored packages of I guess THC gummies. And the first one I picked up to look at the label was 300 milligrams of THC. Now, typically, if I'm working with a patient and we're talking about doses and maybe they haven't started something before and they want to do something with the little THC, I don't know what your opinion is, but I don't recommend more than 2.5, just to see how it feels. And then don't go anywhere. Don't do it. Just stay home, be with someone who loves you, who you feel safe with, and just see how that feels. 300 milligrams, like
300
almost.
milligrams
It's
in a brightly colored,
yeah.
easily accessible
I
package.
mean, if I didn't know any different and I wanted to try it, I would probably look at it and go, "Oh, that looks good. Yeah, let me try that." How harmful could it be? They're selling it in the store. you know,
Absolutely. And
just
it is really that 300, just for our listeners, is an extremely high dose.
it's
And
outrageous.
if you were to eat too much of that, you could have a really bad experience. And,
Yeah,
we've talked about this as well on previous episodes. There are ways to overdose on cannabis. It's not the same kind of overdose as other drugs that can, like opiates can kill you in an overdose, but cannabis
right.
can make you extremely ill, requiring hospitalization. So
Yeah.
when we hear about these brightly colored packages, and sure, there's a warning label on there, but like Peter was talking about, 2.5 milligrams or whatever it is, we start very low and we do it in controlled environments and we go very slowly because, first of all, maybe that's all you need. We want to use the least amount of anything that you need.
Absolutely.
And if that's the dose that works for someone, then that's great. Then we can
Yeah.
stay there and we can build on other types of interventions that are going on. We can look at their diet and their
Right.
lifestyle and their exercise, but we're not just pinning our hopes on this one compound. When I hear
Right.
an individual package of something has 300 milligrams of THC in it, it makes me think of the early cannabis tourism that was going on in our country, where people were going to the early states that had made it legal, like Colorado or California, and they were ingesting way too much cannabis. And there were a number of incidents where people ended up in emergency rooms. It still goes on. Emergency
Yeah.
room visits have certainly increased. And I think one of the biggest concerns, and I think that we're going to start to see increasing regulation around this,
Hmm.
just like we do with the other controlled substances that are legal, the elephants in the room, alcohol and nicotine. There's very tight regulation on how they can be packaged, how they can be advertised, and the types of
Hmm.
warnings that we see. And I think that once we start to see increased regulation, we'll start to see more of that. But
Yeah.
in that interim period, it makes me concerned for the public. It also makes me concerned that children might be attracted to those
Hmm.
brightly colored labels, and it's candy, and it's I know that most dispensaries are pretty sophisticated about looking for ID and making sure that people are of age. But I think that, like you said, especially in New York City, there's this big pop up culture of all of these stores that have opened. And I don't think that they're very closely regulated. Um,
No.
and not to keep going, but I've also noticed that some of them are selling a compound called Delta 8 THC.
Mm.
And this is a synthetic compound, or at least delta 8 THC does naturally occur. But what they're doing is the synthetic compound, and they're adding it back to hemp so that they
Hmm.
can get hemp more cheaply that they can get cannabis. And they're basically spraying it with delta 8 THC. And that has a very different pharmacological profile than THC. And I would recommend that people stay away from it, especially if they're looking for uh,
Yeah.
natural medicines. And again,
Mm.
these pop up stores, I don't think that they're offering their clients certificate of analysis. Um, Even in the medical dispensaries, a lot of people are getting a certification and
Hmm.
they're not talking to an integrative health provider that understands cannabis and how to put it together with all of the other allopathic medicines that someone might be taking. And when I say allopathic, I mean something prescribed to you probably by a doctor in a white coat, but generally speaking, an MD or a DO that is prescribing these medicines, these traditional medicines that are produced by big pharma, right? But
Hmm.
essentially, you have to be very careful because people call them bud tenders, or the people that work in the dispensaries um, are making recommendations for, hey, what do you what do you need, what are you looking for, and it really isn't the same. And I really caution people, and it's not to say that there aren't very knowledgeable people, and some of them are pharmacists with
Hmm.
expertise,
Yeah.
but in general, especially if you're not in a medical dispensary, hopefully you walk in there with a recommendation for what are you going to use, and for what and for how long, just like any other prescription, just like any other health plan,
Hmm.
that you understand what the risks are, you understand what the potential side effects, and like Peter said, you have a plan for, hey, you know what, this is a psychoactive substance, have a plan for the first few times that you're taking this, certainly not safe to drive, things like that, are really important to tell our patients about.
Yeah, it's definitely a new world. The other thing that concerns me, I'd be interested in your opinion is, because I think about college. I remember when I went to college, and when I go, 1986 was my first year of college. I grew up in an Italian family, and in Italian families, like they give the kids a little bit of wine or a touch of beer or something. Probably since they're younger, and not a lot, just a little, just a taste. And I remember going to college and seeing just everyone drinking so heavily, and I, like just kind of losing their mind drinking.
Right.
And I worry about now that cannabis is legalized for that age group, and also knowing the research that suggests that it's just not good for the brain every day until because the brain doesn't form till 25, 26 in terms of complete neural pathways. So that's a huge concern for me, because I think it does, it would allow kids to really think to themselves, "Oh, this is okay. It's legal. I mean, how could it be bad?"
Right.
And and I'm already, we're already seeing, besides the overuse syndrome, just kids that are addicted because of the higher levels of THC. I think if it was the cannabis from the 60s and got legalized, I don't think we'd be seeing the same levels of problems. Yeah.
I agree with that, and the discrete methods that people have now, that it was probably very difficult to uh, smoke pot in a dorm back when we attended college because it would be detected, right? But now people have vape pens, people have edibles,
Yeah.
capsules, mints. It's very easy to
Right.
take large amounts of high potency THC. And like you said, there is a concern that the higher the potency of a drug, the more likely it is to lead to an overuse, and eventually to habituation
Hmm.
and to addiction. And so um, I think one of the major issues is that even though we have ongoing legalization and increased availability and new preparations, we still have a stigma. So
Hmm.
families are very likely to talk about alcohol and say, hey, you know, all right, have a drink with mom and dad, like you were saying, like, oh, a little glass of wine here, and sort of destigmatizes it. It's no big
Right.
deal.
Mm.
You don't drink in excess. You drink little bits amount, and you won't get into trouble with it. And people talk about it. Whereas with
Yeah.
cannabis, a lot of families really don't know much about it. It
Right.
A lot of people, even though we see,
Right.
well, there's crazy statistics on how many Americans have used cannabis, and how many teens have vaped cannabis by the time that they graduate from college. That's all on the rise,
Hmm.
and certainly even high school. All that data is worrying. There was a massive e-cigarette epidemic that we're still dealing with. The federal government is now cracking down on it, but to an extent, it overlaps and extends to cannabis. Vape pens have
Right.
become
Right.
extremely popular
Yeah.
among high school students and college students. And it's something that, if we don't get behind a lot of public education and knowledge, it's like you said, oh, it's legal, then it must be okay. Well, no, it still can be potentially extremely dangerous to people.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you feel about vaping, but in fact, Well, first of all, my view is anything that you're heating and ingesting probably isn't medicinal. I know that smoking has ritualistic connotations in certain contexts, and you know that can be considered medicinal in certain cultures under certain circumstances. So I don't mean to rain on that parade, but certainly vaping, this new technology where you're taking an oil and it's in a metal container and a metal element is heating it and you're inhaling it.
Mm,
I mean, there's all kinds of
yeah,
contaminants in those
yeah,
vape pens, and they are in general very bad for people. And I recommend nobody uses that unless they are under the guidance of a physician as a harm reduction strategy to switch over from smoking cigarettes to vaping e-cigarettes and then eventually tapering that off and quitting those as well.
right,
But,
yeah.
but you bring up a really important point, and it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and having said all that, I just think the potential for benefit um, for so many different conditions is there, and I think, like you said, using it in a context of integrative care, understanding what other medications people are taking, really getting a sense of their physiology and where the challenges are, and working on that all together and creating a plan. I think it can be a really powerful medicine. When I work with patients, either with CBD or if somebody's doing CBD and a little THC, the way I think about it is it's people sometimes can be so stressed, and I kind of think of it like a slinky, right? Oftentimes like the slinky is just closed, and you open the slinky and it opens up and then it snaps back, right? If you keep opening that slinky, eventually it relaxes. It starts to relax. And I think when you use these compounds in the right way, in the right dose, you can just get the body to relax, and then it goes back and you do it, it relaxes. In the meantime, you get people on a better sleeping schedule, you get them eating good quality food, maybe they start moving their bodies, and you keep relaxing it, and you start to see finally the body gets the idea of, oh, okay, I don't have to be in stress mode anymore. Like it's safe here. I can relax, and then the slinky relaxes finally. You don't have to keep pulling it again, and and that's how I see things like what we're talking about, whether it's CBD, cannabis. It can be part of a long-term strategy to kind of just not tell the physiology what to do, but guide it towards a more balanced place than it was before. You know, and,
That really makes a lot of sense. And bringing balance and um, sort of bringing things back to center is the overall function of the endocannabinoid system. So it makes
mm,
perfect sense. Um, it's interesting because there's you have CBD in cannabis or hemp, you have THC in cannabis and hemp.
mm-hmm,
But what's interesting is you have a lot of plants that contain compounds that can also modulate the endocannabinoid system.
yeah,
And without diving too deep, again, the endocannabinoid system is this system that these cannabis compounds acts on in our own body, and our body has substances in it that are similar in some ways to these plant
mm-hmm,
substances that activate this system. But when it gets out of whack, and this is sort of what a lot of the medicines that we prescribe for patients are supposed to do anyway, when our bodies are out of whack and need some help getting over there, well, if we identify an endocannabinoid dysregulation, cannabis becomes a very attractive way to bring someone back to center and get that
mm-hmm,
slinky out of that tight mode and back into that relaxed mode.
yeah,
But there's sort of the turn it on its head, where there's some evidence where people who are too relaxed. We hear about amotivational syndrome in cannabis use, that this is a
mm-hmm,
hallmark of addiction where people just want to sit around, they don't want to do anything, they want to hang out. In fact, there are some patients with ADHD and depression that have trouble getting themselves into a mode where they they're ready to do a task. And then we have anecdotal evidence. We have stories from patients that say, when I take this certain strain of cannabis, it helps motivate me. And I actually am able to clean my house and I'm able to do my chores. And I feel more social and ready to interact with other people so that
Hmm.
it can take us from that end of the spectrum and bring us back to the center as well. And it's one of these mysteries of we don't really understand a lot about
Yeah.
how our brains work, right? And we're still learning that. And that's why I think it's so important that the science catches up, right? Like we started talking about at the beginning of this episode, that now we're starting to look at it again. We kind
Hmm.
of didn't look at it for 100 years, and what didn't we learn about our bodies and our minds in that 100 years by not studying a key to how our bodies and minds work, the endocannabinoid system? There should be no stigma in studying something that our bodies have in them that make, in fact, it's one of the most preserved evolutionary systems. It goes all the way back 500 million years into some of the earliest animals that ever evolved. So
Yeah.
um, I think it's really fascinating that uh, we're at a place in history now. It's an interesting time to be a doctor. It's an interesting time to be a patient, because this plant has now come back and it's entering. But like we said, there's lots of red flags and there's lots of ways things can go poorly. But that certainly it can be extremely helpful.
Yeah, no question. I think it's here to stay in terms of being in the toolbox. I think we have so far to go to learn how to use it in the toolbox. But and that's where I like to rely on some of the old botanical medicine people and old time docs who used it clinically and just have real life experience with it. And I think that's where we need to get our direction from those old time naturopaths and chiropractors and even nurses and people who just held that kind of medicine, when the I think the mainstream just kind of shunned it to the side.
Absolutely. Um, there's even some evidence that it can have antimicrobial properties. And look, this
Mm,
makes sense. Like we
yeah,
were talking about, it has these compounds in it that are made to protect the plant. And
right.
plants are under attack from bacteria and fungi as well. And now we're getting to a point in history where the microbes, and these are the bacteria and the viruses, they're developing resistance to our
Hmm.
best antibiotics, to our most powerful antibiotics. And so we need
Hmm.
new ways of thinking about what is medicine, how do we create medicine, and certainly cannabis is part of that. But like we were
Yeah,
talking about, a good diet, a healthful way to approach living, and really aligning yourself with good practitioners who are knowledgeable, who understand your health history. Those are the types of things that can really help people remain healthy, get healthy when they're not healthy, and understand their health and
yeah,
try to avoid some of these pitfalls like we've been talking about.
yeah. I think it's the best uh, outcomes that I see on a continual basis occurs when you do a few things together in synergy. You address sleep. If those are issues, address digestion. Make sure people are having bowel movements every day. Really important. We make sure we're moving our body, drinking enough water, eating good quality food most of the time, right? Maybe every once in a while I'll have an indulgence, but for the most of the
Oh
time,
yeah.
try to enjoy. And then if there are certain deficiencies or things out of balance, that's where things like vitamins can come in. And then if symptoms are to the point where it's an urgent issue or there's a safety issue, then drugs, can be very helpful. But if we use the drug, let's use the drug to, get a person out of a major concern or urgent situation so that they're safe, and then eventually try to still figure out what the underlying issues are as much as we can. So
Absolutely. And to approach those underlying issues with these integrative interventions. And um,
yeah.
well, we've covered an enormous amount of material today, and I hope that it was easily digestible to our audience. I know that I enjoyed talking about it, and we could probably spend the next 5 hours talking about this, but
Oh my
I,
gosh, it usually. It's
but I do want to really thank you for coming on the show. It was really enjoyable for me. I learned a lot, and I had a really great time talking with you and learning about the context and how do we look at this new, old, whatever we want to look at it as, this newly available to people in the 21st century medicine or medicinal in our armamentarium. Um, and again, thank you so much for coming on. And
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for teaching us and being here.
oh, Peter, I hope that you'll come back on the podcast and talk to us more about these interesting topics.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, thanks again for tuning in to BrainMender. We have some really interesting episodes coming up in the future, so keep tuning in every other week. And please, if you enjoyed today's podcast, send us a like and subscribe and download these episodes. That really helps us. And share this with any of your friends and family that might be interested. And thanks again for tuning in to BrainMender.